person attendee program. As we get started, rest assured of two things. Number one, the professional panel of presenters involved here today are truly qualified to discuss the topic of reserve studies. And we intend to relay a great deal of valuable information to you. Additionally, and equally or greaterly important, we're offering the opportunity for a meaningful question and answer dialogue as part of the program. Number two, your three presenters are total rookies at working in this webinar format. So wish us luck, work together with us, and feel free to offer constructive input as we go through this. As is the case in any meaningful educational program, the attendees are just as important to the success of the program as the presenters. The basic goals of this program are the following. Number one, to clarify the actual scope of service in the preparation of a professionally prepared reserve study per the established industry guidelines. Two, to clarify what is appropriate for inclusion in the component listing in a reserve study. Three, to discuss how a community association should make use of the study. And four, to offer the opportunity to answer questions. The first portion of the program deals with the preparation of a reserve study. Specifically, how the scope of work is formed and defined, and how the calculations are derived. This information will be provided by Russ Fernandes of Becht Engineering. Way back in the 1990s, Russ was actually a member of the committee designated by the CAI to establish the requirements for the professional qualifications for the Reserve Study Specialist designation. The primary task given to that committee of experts was to establish the required content and the guidelines for preparing a professional report. So Russ, let's get started.
All right, thanks, Bill. So question number one, what is a capital reserve fund? It's essentially a savings account for your association. In an association, any association, you know there are certain items that are going to have to be replaced. Those items are known, they're finite, they're cyclical in nature, they have a finite life expectancy. A hot water heater, it has a known life expectancy. Starting at 10 years, you can stretch them out, maybe you get 15, if you're really lucky, maybe you get 20, but all in all, you need to plan for the eventual replacement. If you were a single family homeowner, you would just take it out of your savings account when you needed a water heater or a roof, or if you didn't have the money, you would take a loan and pay it back over time. And the same is true with an association. There's only so many places you're going to get money to make these replacements, and unfortunately, it all boils down to you, the homeowners. Whether it's coming out of a savings vehicle like a reserve fund, or whether it's going to be a loan that the homeowners have to pay out. The thing to remember about the reserve, the whole process of the reserve fund, is that it's a matter of equity. Everyone that purchases and lives in a community should be putting away a percentage for this eventual replacement each year while they live there. So if unit owner A moves in year one, and just to keep numbers simple, it's a $100,000 roof replacement. Every year they should be putting 1/10 of that cost of the roof away. We'll forget about inflation and interest for the moment, so that 20 years out, or 10 years out rather, that the money's available, or 20 years out, whatever the math works out to be. And the reason that's very equitable is that if that unit owner moves out after, say, 5 years, the unit owner coming in picks up and continues with the reserve funding, so that every owner pays a percentage, a proper percentage, whether or not they live there for the entire length of time that they're in the community. So this is all determined by a capital reserve study, and that is basically a funding recommendation for the building up the funds necessary to pay for these items, as we've discussed. Some of the criteria, of course, it's got to be a common element. So your bylaws and your documents come into play here, because we want to make sure that you're not saving for, and this sometimes quite often comes up with items like windows. Is it a common element or is it a unit owner item? Only common elements are reserved for. It's also going to be typically, Bill mentioned the reserve standards we set up. We typically look at a 30-year window. That's not to say that something that has a life expectancy greater than 30 years never gets reserved for. It just doesn't necessarily show up in the very beginning. So if you have a 40-year siding item, for example, you're going to start thinking about reserving for that probably in about 10 years, and you can add it to your study at that point. The account should be funded at least annually. So the funds are they come from your maintenance expenditures, your maintenance fees every month, and it's up to the association when they actually transfer that money into the capital reserve fund from their operating. But it should be done at least annually. And the whole idea is to prevent the need for special assessments. Nobody likes special assessments. When I do these presentations in person, I always kid with the board members that if you don't want to be a board member anymore, just pass a special assessment, and by the next voting cycle you'll be out. And you also want to prevent borrowing, although borrowing money is at the moment at least fairly inexpensive, so it's not that terrible an alternative. But ultimately, the money's coming from the homeowners, so either way, it's going to be on you. Next slide, Steve. So, mortgage lenders have started over the years. I mean, it's been going on for a while now, but they tend to be very concerned about inaccurate reserves. We get calls all the time from associations, and it's amazing they're still out there. Obviously not members of CAI, but we get calls, oh, I need a reserve study by the end of the week because someone's trying to sell a unit and they can't get their loan approved because the reserves are not proper. So mortgage lenders now are really starting to look at that. They have been over the years, and it tends to go in cycles too. And this is all written, and we're talking pre-coronavirus. What happens after in terms of funding is going to be very interesting to see. But the reserves are an important part of preserving the qualities of your community. A big part of your value of any real estate, of course, you always hear location, location, location. But the next item on that list, item number 4, is probably curb appeal. And if you have two associations across the street from one another, the association with the new roof, the shiny black new pavement, the one that looks the nicest, it's going to have the bigger values. Their unit's going to sell for more, all other things being equal. So reserve studies, reserve funds rather, capital reserves, they're directly related to your investment. Our homes tend to be our biggest investments, or one of our biggest investments, and we just, whether you're a single-family homeowner or a community association unit owner, you have to pay to keep up the property to maximize our profits. Next slide, please. Where are we going? So what is a capital reserve study? Capital reserve study provides a snapshot in time. So when we're asked to do a reserve study, we go out and look at the property. We're looking at and we put the study together. We're looking at it from this point in time and trying to project out over typically 30 years how the funding is going to work for a given association. It's also a capital reserve study, and Bill mentioned before the RS standards that CAI has put together that I was involved with early on. prior to that, anyone could do a capital reserve study. We had, and nothing against these people, but we had, contractors doing reserve studies, and the RS standards set some minimum standards with the reserve specialist designation, so that there is a criteria of who should do a reserve study. But the professionally prepared document, it's one that's done by somebody with some financial background, because there's a lot of spreadsheet work, but also the construction experience. And so most reserve preparers are very keyed into what things cost, and that's usually based on a wealth of experience over time for replacing these types of items. Next slide, please. Is a reserve study necessary? It's hard to say this without sounding self-serving, because this is what we do for a living, but reserve studies are very important. As I said, lending institutions are starting to look into the reserve studies of associations where they are writing loans. Some states have requirements for reserve studies. Some governments, some county governments have specific requirements. So more and more, we're starting to see where this is the need is being put into government requirements as well. But regardless of whether or not it's a government requirement, there is the F word in association living and being on a board, and that's fiduciary. And boards have a fiduciary responsibility to the association, and there has been case law where adequate reserves have been deemed a fiduciary responsibility of an association. So boards have to maintain their fiduciary responsibility, provide for the funding of the future replacements. Again, there's no surprises. We know if you have a roof, it's going to need to be replaced at some point. If you have asphalt paving, concrete sidewalks, whatever, they're going to need to be replaced. If you're in a high-rise building, I don't know if any of you are high-rise board members or unit owners, but you have a whole slew of items that need to go to a reserve study just on the mechanical and electrical side alone. Boilers, chillers, cooling towers, heating systems, pumps. There's a lot more that goes into the reserve study for a high-rise building. But again, the whole idea of the reserve study is to evenly spread the cost over the life of the components to try to avoid special assessments, the need for special assessments, loans, and just again, it's a matter of fairness. We want everyone to pay their fair share for the period of time that they are living in that community. If you bought in year one and moved out, say in year 19, the year before the roof gets replaced, and you didn't fund a reserve study, you get away scot-free and not have to pay for that roof. Unfortunately, the person that moved in year 19 would probably get hit with a special assessment to replace a roof that they never even got to use. So it's a matter of equity and fairness. Next slide, please. Who prepares a reserve study? Again, the qualified individuals. Engineering background is very healthy. My late partner, Charlie Becht, who's a diehard old school engineer, used to bristle at calling these reserve studies because as far as he was concerned, it was engineering economic life cycle cost analysis, I think is what he called it. It was an engineering document in the very beginning, and then community associations adopted it for their use. We used to do these years ago for industrial plants, for commercial real estate, things like that. Basically the same document, but now it's called a reserve study. But it is an engineering document in the, as its basis. So engineering background, construction background is very important, along with some financial aptitude as well, because again, you'll see a few slides in, we're talking about interest and inflation and how that affects the money you're putting away. I'll put a big plug in here for the CAI and their reserve specialist designation, but that is a good benchmark of competency for reserve preparations. And there also is another organization, APRA, and they have very similar designation, and a lot of reserve preparers have both designations. But the reserve specialist in CAI are required to perform a certain number of studies over the year and follow the standards. So when you use a CAI reserve specialist, you know, there is a baseline competency in that. Next slide, please. Okay. Reserve study updates. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, you can't just do a reserve study once and expect that it's going to last for the life of the communities, or even 10 years or so. Those people that call us up, with needing a reserve study by the end of the week, it's amazing how many we find that when you ask them, well, do you have a reserve study now? They say yes, and then they tell me, it's the one that the developer prepared in the reserve in the offerings documents. And those tend to be inaccurate at the very least, but if it's more than a couple of years old, it's going to be outdated. Costs keep going up, unfortunately. It's a fact of life. Something we're going to see now, although I don't know if it's ever going to be reflected in the cost of the items, but with petroleum now trading at, I think it was $17 a barrel the last as of Friday, costs could go down. Petroleum is used or involved in almost every construction component you can think of: vinyl siding, asphalt roof shingles, asphalt paving. So it's more so when the price of petroleum goes up that we see cost increases. Petroleum drops as it has now, I don't know that we're going to see a drop. We don't normally see the downside of those things, unfortunately. We only see when it goes up. But there are a number of reasons that reserve studies should be updated just to keep them current. The next reason for the reserve study update is to make sure that the life expectancy is accurately predicted. Becht Engineering, obviously by its name, is an engineering company, but we don't have a crystal ball that tells us how long these items are going to last. It's based on, this is any reserve provider, they base the life expectancies on visual observations typically, compared to their experience at previous properties. So if we look at something in year one, we don't really have history. We don't know what it looked like 3 years ago. So on an update, which incidentally the CAI says you should update every 3 to 5 years, we want to look to see how the items are wearing, how they're aging. And quite often we're able to extend the life expectancy. When you look at a roof, for example, and we say, hey, that roof looks pretty good. We only gave it 15 years last time. Maybe we can bump it up and again stretch out the life expectancies of these items to make it a little easier to pay for over time. So the condition and the expected life can change dramatically, sometimes in a very short period of time. Hail damage is a good example. I've seen roofs that, even young roofs, if you go through a hailstorm or a tornado or even a hurricane, depending on where your properties are located, that life expectancy is going to drop dramatically. Maybe the hail damage wasn't such that it caused leaks, so typically it may not need to be replaced right at that moment, but it is certainly going to shorten the life expectancy of a roof. On the other side of the coin, though, there's probably an insurance claim involved, and the money that you receive for that insurance claim could go into the reserve study to increase the balance and help pay for that item when it requires replacement. Next slide. Next slide. So I already mentioned that associations should, according to CAI documents, and I strongly support them, should update their studies every 3 to 5 years. 3 years for older communities and more complicated communities, I mentioned the high-rise buildings. I recommend on a high-rise building with extensive mechanical equipment, update those studies every 3 years or so. A newer community maybe can stretch that out to the 5-year. But I also recommend that boards look at the reserves every year themselves. Just go through one of your meetings, go through it and make sure that everything's still tracking, because you guys with your boots on the ground know that, hey, we ended up having to replace a bunch of pavement. Maybe you had a pipe break or something that required a street to be repaved. Well, that should be reflected in the new reserve study, so that your reserves remain as accurate as possible. But every 3 to 5 years is the typical answer to how often a reserve study should be updated. Next slide, please. Is it time for an update? Well, we mentioned the 3 to 5 year criteria. Unfortunately, many associations do not do that. And we often get the call when a new management company takes over, that, hey, looking at the documents here, they haven't had a reserve study in quite a few years. We need to get it updated. Factors to consider: has there been a significant repair or replacement recently? Has it been 3 years? Are items wearing out faster than they should be, or that they predicted to be? Or the other side I mentioned that the coin is, are they lasting longer? Can we get away with stretching some of these things out? Associations have to deal with a lot of different expenditures, and many of them unplanned. In this part of the world, you get an unexpectedly snowy winter, and suddenly your snow removal costs are through the roof, and you don't have enough money. It's not a bad time to look at a reserve study at that point and say, hey, can we stretch some of this out? Is it realistic to think that we can we can make these last a little longer? A good example is asphalt paving. Nothing looks better than a new application of asphalt. It's nice and dark, and it's shiny and new. But the reality is, you can drive on asphalt with cracks for quite a period of time. You want to make sure there's no safety hazards, no trip hazards. But beyond that, some crack filling can extend the life expectancy of asphalt and maybe get you through a tough patch in your budget cycle. And the other factors are the interest and inflation rates. If inflation goes through the roof, which I'm not an economist, but I think with all the money that we're spending right now, that we have to spend, obviously, with this COVID virus, there's probably going to be some inflation down the road. So, we're doing reserve studies now with inflation rates of maybe 2 to 3%. Obviously, if inflation spikes, you're going to need to redo those studies to reflect more accurately what's happening, in the world around us. So interest rates and interest associations obviously can and are earning interest on the money they have in the bank. Right now, it's not a huge amount because interest rates are so low, but if those rates start to go up, that needs to be factored into the reserve study as well. Next slide, please. So, how do we prepare a reserve study? First, I mentioned early on, we have to qualify the item. It has to be a common element. It's something that the association is responsible for. You're not replacing individual homeowner, air conditioning, unless that's the way your documents are drawn up. But there needs to be a review of the offering statement and the existing reserve study, if there is one, to make sure that the items that we are reserving for are responsibility of the association. Next, we have to quantify. So we spend a lot of time walking around with measuring wheels and measuring tapes and counting things, and we need to know. We need to know the square footage of the roofs, the square yardage of the asphalt paving. we need to know how much of everything you have. Be careful of reserve studies that use lump sum quantities, because that's going to make it very difficult for you to get an update in the future. The nice thing about updates, they're typically less expensive than the new study because we don't have to remeasure everything unless you've done an addition. But sometimes we'll see studies with the lump sum designation where they'll say, you know, paving. Well, that paving cost us $100,000, so that's the number we're going to use. But unfortunately, if you don't know the actual quantity, when you do an update, or maybe you've replaced only part of the asphalt paving in the last year, you need to go out and measure everything at that point. So a reserve study should have the quantities for the items. We need to make a determination on how long we think the thing's going to last, and as I said, that's based on visual observation to determine condition. It's very important to emphasize that the visual inspection only in most cases. Sometimes with boilers, working with an association, we'll recommend some testing boilers and some of the other big components, just to get a better feel for how long things are going to last, what the condition is. But that's not a typical reserve study. Reserve studies, the inspection for a reserve study, by and large, and this is all preparers I'm familiar with, are visual inspections. It's also not a safety inspection. So certainly if we go through and do an inspection, if we see something that we feel is a safety hazard, we're going to point it out to you, but it's not the purpose of our inspection. So it's a different scope of work. If we were to do some sort of safety inspection, we'd spend a lot more time looking at different things, right? But for a reserve study, we're looking just to determine basic condition. And then obviously we prepare the report for the association. Next slide. So I already went through this for the most part, but the criteria for the reserve studies, common elements, as I've mentioned, life expectancy less than 30 years or less. Sometimes we'll put that out to 40 years to pick up vinyl siding. Years ago, we always heard the saying that vinyl is final, and most preparers were not including vinyl siding in reserve studies. The conventional wisdom has shifted in that, and we're starting to put vinyl siding in with a 40-year life expectancy. It may last forever, but that doesn't mean it's going to stay on your building forever. It also doesn't mean that it's not going to fade or to otherwise age to the point where, although it might still be serving its function, aesthetically it's not. It's no longer appealing. And again, back to the comment on curb appeal, it's a good idea to consider replacing things like vinyl siding, vinyl shutters for aesthetic reasons to maintain the investment. And also, we're looking at replacement of common elements. We are not including maintenance items. Actually, the IRS got involved many years ago and made a ruling that items such as painting, for example, are not a capital replacement, so they should not be considered, not be included in a reserve study. I've seen preparers that do include painting, and I think they're running a risk, but it also depends on how associations file their taxes. So, working with your accountant, you can sometimes include painting, although ideally we want to, whenever we can, we recommend replacing items that may require painting with newer products. PVC trim is a big one. I can't tell you how many associations I see replacing rotted window trim with new pine trim, which is just going to rot, in a couple of years. There's PVC trim now, which will last forever, basically. Vinyl siding lasts a lot longer than wood siding. And we do a lot of siding replacements. I always hear association members scream, "Oh, we like our wood. We don't want to go with vinyl." And they like their wood, but it's cupped, cracked, splitting. and it looks like hell. And it happens in a very short period of time now because of the use of the new growth wood. Whereas vinyl siding, it's not like the old aluminum siding from the days probably when most of us grew up. But there's some very nice vinyl products. So whenever possible, we want to replace with something that will last longer. Next slide, please. So on the list, typically architectural items like roofing, gutters, leaders, and incidentally, these slides, and normally I'll ask the question if I'm doing a presentation live on how many people live in a high-rise building as opposed to a townhouse or a garden-style building. But mostly slides are geared towards the low-rise buildings, townhouses, maybe mid-rise. But you'll see carryover. Roofing, for example, most people think of asphalt shingles, but of course on a high-rise building you have flat roofing. Gutters and leaders you might not have in high-rise buildings, decks and balconies, and siding, as I discussed earlier. We're now including that up to 40 years in many studies. But that gives you a flavor for what's included in that category. Next slide, please. On the electrical side, site lighting fixtures, common area building lightings. If you have a clubhouse, and I know many associations have quite large clubhouse buildings, there's a lot of electrical components in those buildings. Many times there's also heaters, saunas, things like that that would all be included. Next slide, please. On the mechanical side, common HVAC equipment. So I mentioned we're not replacing individual unit owner mechanical equipment in most cases, but there are some instances where the individual homeowner heating systems are common elements. It's more common in high-rise buildings, sometimes older garden apartments with a common boiler system. Whatever it is, we have to do the research to find out what your requirements are and whether or not to include it. Pool pumps, pool equipment, if you have a pool, clubhouse HVAC. As I mentioned, we're seeing some very elaborate clubhouses with some very elaborate multi-zone HVAC systems. It all needs to be replaced at some point, and any buildings with fire suppression systems. And then the site. Most associations, the largest two items in a reserve study are roofs and asphalt paving, and concrete's usually a close second. So on the site, it's paving and concrete, retaining walls. Back in the condo boom of say the 80s, which I can't believe it now, but that's over 30 years ago. Developers were just starting to build this type of construction, and they were going for the easier properties to build on. Montgomery County is a good example. In Maryland, it was farm, and then they came in and just started planting condos, across the county. Well, those sites filled up, those easy developable sites, were taken, were used, were built on. So developers have shifted to the more difficult sites. We're seeing this up and down the East Coast, where developers are building on sites they never would have built on before. And the way they do that, the way they level a hilly site, is with retaining walls. And so, and most developers don't include retaining walls in a reserve study yet. I can tell you from experience, they do deteriorate and they do require replacement, and they can be as expensive as all get out. I know there's a few very large retaining walls in Montgomery County that we've been involved with over the years. I'm seeing it up and down the East Coast now. The retaining walls are very expensive, and they're not going to last forever. And you have to come to grips with that realization and plan for how you're going to replace them when they need to be replaced. The obvious recreational facilities, tennis courts, playgrounds, pool decks. A note on playgrounds. The safety codes over the years have become more stringent. When I was growing up, we used to hang upside down on the jungle gym over an asphalt parking lot. A couple kids fell off every once in a while, you know, they got scratched up, but we basically survived. But now playground equipment, playgrounds in general, there's a safety code that has to be followed. So when you replace a playground, it's not typically, depending on when it was built, just replacing the swing set, but you have to provide the cushioned surfaces. You have to have it large enough so, you know, kids can fall and still not hit a fence or whatever. So that cost can be significant. Pool decks, fencing, and other recreational facilities. I didn't mention it, it might be in the next slide actually, but we see a lot of gym equipment. If it's not leased, then you have to plan for its replacement. Dumpster and recycling areas, mail structures, and drainage structures. If you have a detention basin, you're not going to reserve for the basin itself. People sometimes ask about dredging. Dredging is a maintenance expense, but you do have many times concrete structures within those detention basins, and they should be reserved for. Next slide, please. So there's different ways to calculate the reserve funding in a reserve study. And you may have heard some of these terms banted about in discussions. And we spent a lot of time at the RS committee with CAI discussing how these should be dealt with. But there's two basic, well, I'll start from the beginning. Back in the old days, the component method, which is also called the straight line method, was the only way to calculate a reserve study. And it is still the basis for any of the other methods I'm going to mention. It all starts out with a component method, which is essentially an inventory of the item, how much we think it's going to cost to replace, and how long we think it's going to last. Where it starts to deviate from the next method, which is the cash flow method. In the component method, you look at that $100,000 roof. Maybe it's got a 20-year life expectancy. At year 10, you should have $50,000, forgetting interest and inflation for the moment. And then the calculation does that same the study does that same calculation for the next item, whether it's asphalt paving. And again, whatever percentage of its age has passed, that's the percentage of money you should have in the fund for that next item. So what the basic calculation says that when that roof needs to be replaced, you're only going to use the money that's in the line item for roofing, and you're going to forget about the other money you have in a fund for any of the other items. So that tends to end up with larger closing balances. It ends up, many associations find you end up over reserving compared to the cash flow method. So, and you know, even if you were a single family homeowner, if you needed that roof, well, you're going to raid the kids' Christmas funds or whatever it is. You're going to take the money from wherever you can get it to make that expenditure. And that's basically what the cash flow or pooling method takes into account. The way that works is it looks at year by year at the planned expenditures and calculates how much money needs to be set aside so that those yearly expenditures are met. It doesn't differentiate by unit type in the calculation. There always tends to be a worst case year. There's just one year, whether it's 10 years out, 15 years out, where the planets align and everything comes due at once. Now, hopefully we can avoid that by maybe stretching some things out, but the calculation has to have enough money, has to be such that there's enough money in the fund to make that expenditure at a given day. So that's how we figure out how much we need to put away each year. We calculate how much needs to be put away to meet that worst case year, and it avails the association of all the money that's in the fund, regardless of what line item it went in for. You'll sometimes hear the word threshold in reserve studies, and that really refers to the cash flow or pooling method, when the programs, the reserve study programs, do their calculations, they'll calculate down so that that worst case year, after you've made that expenditure, you've used all your money, and you have to start reserving again moving forward. Now, it's never a good idea, keeping in mind that the basis of these studies are all estimates, cost estimates, life expectancy estimates. We don't want to imply a degree of accuracy that doesn't exist. So it's never advisable to take your fund down to zero. So we recommend that there be a threshold, another word would be a cushion, so that that worst case year, you're not taking it down to zero, you're leaving some money, so that if one of the projections doesn't work out, it may be something needed to be replaced sooner, or something was more expensive than was estimated originally, you have some cushion to play with. Next slide, please, sorry. So as I mentioned, the component method, it's the most conservative approach. That's what we did in the very beginning. That's Charlie Becht's life cycle cost analysis. That's what we did. And as I mentioned, it looks at each item individually and assumes that that money is only going to be used for that item. And we tend to include interest and inflation. This was another topic of debate with the RS committee, whether or not to include interest and inflation. And we believe it should be used, it should be considered because it's reality. Inflation hits and you'll get some interest. The objection to that was that some of the providers were saying that, oh, we have no idea what the interest is going to be over 30 years, or what the inflation is going to be, in over 30 years. And the counter to that is that the document is an estimate across the board. It's all based on estimates, so we can also estimate interest and inflation. However, if you're updating these studies every 3 to 5 years, any unknowns that come into play can be adjusted for before it becomes critical to the funding. Next slide, please. So I've already gone through some of these examples about the component method. That's the $100,000 roof, 10 years. So every year you'd be putting away $10,000, and then you do the same calculation for each item in the study. And then you can see the effects of a sinking fund calculation with a 3% inflation estimate and a 1% interest rate. The annual contribution would be lowered a little bit to $9,558 in this example, which doesn't sound like a huge difference, but when you do that for every item and you have a particularly large study, it can have a profound effect. Next slide, please. So this is an example from a reserve study, and it just shows this is the nuts and bolts page. This is where all the fun starts. You'll see the highlighted box is the replacement cost for each item, and what you're not seeing here is how that cost is determined, because we just really couldn't fit it in a spreadsheet. It would just make everything too small. And I'm at the point now where I have this enlarged on my screen and I still have my glasses on, but you'll see the items listed. We discussed balconies, gutters, electrical items, mechanical items, but we list all the replacement costs. Next slide, please. The next box you're looking on that same page is the age information. So the present age, estimated remaining life, and the typical life. On newer studies, those quite often add up, where the present age plus the estimated remaining life will meet the typical life. Not always, doesn't have to be the case. Sometimes we'll have a typical life that is exceeded because of exceptionally either exceptionally good luck, exceptional maintenance, or a combination of the above. We can see items that surpass their typical life. And conversely, we see items that don't always make their typical life. So those numbers don't have to add up. And next slide, please. The basic concept here is the replacement cost divided by the estimated remaining life gives you how much should be put away moving forward to have enough money for the replacement. Of course, again, in this slide, we're not taking into account interest and inflation. It does say it up top, but at the moment we're not. It's not included in the slide. In the next slide, you'll see the percent of total column. Thank you. So we talked about there's a couple things. When we do a reserve study, we always ask how much money the association currently has in their fund. And so since we don't want, many of our studies will add an item that wasn't in the previous study. So what we do is determine what each item's percent of total is so that we can allocate the money that you have on deposit, what we call the present fund, allocate that over all the items. And that's really the only place where that percent of total comes into play. Next slide. And at the end, we want to come up with the contribution, the basic annual contribution. But if we have a surplus or a deficit in the component method, we have to make that up, make that money up. So we do a calculation where we figure out how much money, in addition to the basic annual contribution, needs to be set aside to make up for any deficits. That's only in the component method. In the cash flow method, which I think it starts on the next slide, we start talking about the cash flow. I have a spreadsheet coming up where you'll see that that's all worked in. In the component method, the contribution adjustment or the deficit is made up in a separate column, but it all gets rolled into one calculation in cash flow method. Again, because we're looking not at individual items, but just at what the expenditures are at the end of the year. Next slide, please. So with the cash flow or pooling method, it's less conservative, but I have to tell you, I can probably count on one hand in the last 5 years where we've had associations following the straight line or the component method. Most every association uses now the cash flow or pooling method. And Bill and I are in different offices, so he may have a different opinion on that, but I'll let him speak to that later. Most associations I deal with are using this cash flow method. The only exceptions tend to be younger associations that maybe had a windfall, i.e. they had a lawsuit that settled in their favor and they had a boatload of money they had to put someplace. So in that instance, since the component method uses more cash, some associations with that problem, nice problem to have, too much money, they'll use the component method. Most everyone else in the real world uses the cash flow method. As I mentioned previously, it pools all the components and assumes that the money contributed is available to the replacement of any item, just like a single-family homeowner would do, if they had to make a major expenditure. You're going to take the money from wherever you can get it. And as I mentioned, the annual contribution is determined. The calculation basically lowers the contribution. It's an iterative function. We actually use a visual basic calculation, but it's amazing how long it takes to actually run these studies. A large study can take us two hours to run on the computer because the way the calculation is done, it's a trial and error. It's going to throw a contribution estimate in and then back it down over and over again until that calculation gets that worst case year, as I mentioned, down to 0 before we put in a threshold. So that's basically how that calculation is done. Next slide, please. So on the cash flow or pooling method, see it's a different spreadsheet, and we have the opening balance, contribution adjustment. You'll see no contribution adjustment. We have the column there, but it's always going to be zeros. and we show what the disbursements are year by year. And in this case, the worst case year is year 2031, if my eyes are doing me justice. So if you look up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that we ended up with a threshold, which was 5% of the replacement cost in this particular study. And this was an actual study we did several years ago that we just sanitized, so the names of the guilty are not shown. But it's an actual study. So in this particular study, we ended up with a 5% threshold of $185,000, 185,549, and you'll see that study, that number shows up, the closing balance of year 2031, which was the worst case year. They had over $2 million of expenditures in that particular year. So instead of showing a zero at the closing balance at the end of that year, we have that threshold. The threshold is kind of arbitrary. We tend to use 5 or 10% of the total replacement cost of all the items. We have some associations that maybe have a CD sitting somewhere that they want to use as their cushion, and we'll put that number in. There's a number of ways that can be done, but absent any particular request, it's typically 5 or 10% of the replacement cost. Next slide, please. Oh, and we're up to Scott. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to mute myself and listen to Scott Dalley, who incidentally, Scott and I go back probably 30 plus years. I don't want to give up our ages, but we've been working, Scott's been working with Becht Engineering. We've been working with Scott many years. So Scott, have at it.
Well, thank you very much, Russ. And I got to say that, as always, your presentation was extraordinarily thorough, which also kind of lets me off the hook a little bit and lets me talk about a few specific situations, especially as it relates to boards and community managers and what they need to do once they have a reserve study in hand. And I suppose to start off the first, there is some information that either the community through the board, or if it's a large community, it may have a committee that is been tasked with helping to start this new reserve study or have the reserve study updated. There's some information that the community has to provide to the preparer, to the reserve specialist, so that information in that study is pertinent. And one of the things is it has to provide them with an opening balance. The amount of cash that's on hand for replacements for reserve items, that has to be very accurate. And the reserve specialist needs to know that so that they can, so that their calculations can make some sense in the end. Also, if you've done any reserve projects recently, you need to provide the reserve specialist with the information from that. You may look at, for example, if you have concrete sidewalks in the community, and it says on your reserve study that the replacement cost is, for example, $10.50 a square foot to do the replacement, but you've just done a replacement for part of it, and after going out to competitive bidding in your area, you're paying, say, $11.75 a square foot. That's something that the reserve specialist needs to know, because those kind of things can change and can be variable, and to try to make sure that you have a study that is really helpful to you, you need to be keeping track of these things, and especially the community managers need to note that and keep a file. And that reserve study, Russ mentioned, was updated every 3 to 5 years, but it's kind of a living and breathing document. It's not just something that sits in the file cabinet and comes out every 3 years to be updated. Community managers and boards should be aware that any projects that they're doing need to be kept track of and shared with your reserve specialist, so that as you do your next study, the information in it is as accurate and therefore as useful as it can be. Okay, so you also need to make sure the board and management needs to make sure, as important as all the components that are in the study, and Russ alluded to this earlier, you need to make sure you understand what components are, not in the study. And I think we could go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I slid into my next slide, but so the association can have, Russ alluded to vinyl siding as an example, that can have a life expectancy more than the 30-year window, which you also spoke about. Some other things, though, there are often soft costs that are associated with replacement projects that the boards need to consider. You may need to, if you have an extensive asphalt replacement project going on, you may need to have somebody from the engineering company out to be observing, and also to be making sure that all the specifications that were established in that project are being adhered to. You may or may not see those. You probably won't see them in the reserve study, but you need to be aware that you may incur those kind of costs associated with that replacement thing. So it's good to keep things like that in mind, and also things that are outside of the window in the reserve study that have a life expectancy of more than 30 years. As those as those assets begin, as the community gets a little bit older, you're at year 15 and you didn't have siding in your original reserve study, and it's got a 40-year life expectancy, and now you're at year 15. That siding needs to come in, because if it doesn't, it can be an extraordinarily expensive reality at some point that the association's not going to be real happy about getting if you haven't considered it and haven't figured out what you're going to do with it. Next slide, please. So again, with this new reserve study, you have to make sure that the financial information in the study accurately reflects the association's finances, and I alluded to that earlier. But especially that beginning balance number, you have to make sure that that actually equals the cash that you have. And I don't want to get into a lot of thoughts about accounting methods and so forth, but I've seen associations where they actually put a fund balance in that didn't actually reflect the cash amount that the people had in reserves, and it can be a rude awakening. So when you're giving the reserve specialist the number, it needs to be the actual, it actually needs to be the cash that you have, and it's important that they have that. And then it's also important that whoever's looking at this, whether I said the board or whether it was a committee that you appointed and the community manager, they need to understand the parameters and assumptions made by the preparer of the study. And I always think that it's a really good idea when a new study is being done for the preparer and the board, or if it's a committee that was put in charge, and the community manager to all meet and review the study. I mean, you spent some money on it. This is a very important document, and it's going to be used to make a lot of decisions and a lot of important decisions. And it's important that everybody understands what it is, or at least if you've got a couple of board members who are in charge of that particular area, at least they understand, and the community manager understands the study, what it entails, what it doesn't entail. And you should sit down and talk to your preparer and ask them questions, and make sure you understand it, because as I said, it's a very important document. And once you understand the study, then there could be some areas that you may not agree with or have some questions about, and you need to get those out, and then you're pretty confident once you've done that you've got the document that you want, and that it's actually going to be helpful to the community. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is for everybody to understand that. It's critically important. I'll go to the next slide, please. So the reserve study, I think Russ alluded to this too, is a planning tool. That's what it is, but it's a very important one, and it affects not just the assets that are in the reserve study, but how do you save and so forth. So if after you've got this new reserve study, you take a look at it and you say, oh my gosh, we don't have enough money in our reserve. We've got all these projects coming up, and how are we going to deal with them? And so, it helps you, once you've got a good one in hand, it helps you look at, are we going to need to have a special assessment? And as Russ alluded to earlier, that's usually, the least palatable way to go. But, I've seen associations recently, loans are becoming, because of the lower interest rates and so forth, sometimes a more palatable way to deal with, a deficit in or shortfall, I should say, in the reserves. And then, increasing the reserve contribution, if you have the study done and there's time, and you have a little bit of time before you're going to have to do these projects, and you're currently not in a good position. Through the budgeting process, you can increase your contribution to the reserve. So those are a few ways that you can deal with things if you realize that you're going to have a shortfall at some point. The reserve study also helps you schedule your investments. So I certainly hope that the community associations have reserve accounts set up, and that you're investing those in CDs and so forth. And although the interest rates and CDs are not so great, that's the place where you're doing it. But sometimes you can get a better rate if you're able to invest your money out a little bit further, out for several years. And by having a good reserve study and understanding when the projects that you're going to have to spend the money on are coming due, you can gauge your CD ladder or your investment ladder accordingly. So you don't have to have all of your cash sitting in a money market, not doing anything for you. You can put it in certificates deposit, invest it out, and get as much interest as you can on that. And on that subject, I think it's, Russ alluded to it also earlier, that it's a good policy to, allocate the interest that's earned on your reserves to go right back into your reserves. I know some associations look at that as income, and they put it into income in their operating accounts, so they don't earmark it specifically for the reserves. But, it's been my experience over the years, and I think really it's the best practice to always to take any interest earned from your reserve investments and put it right back into reserves and not use it for anything else. And then once you've done all that, communicating the results of the reserve study to the community is important. Probably the hardest thing for people who aren't board members or involved in the operations of the community on a day-to-day basis to understand is why we're putting away all this money, into this, reserve thing. I'm only going to live here for the next 5 years, so what do I care about that? And Russ, mentioned about the fairness and paying for those assets while you're living there, and that's the equitable part of it. You don't just get a free ride while you're living in the community. Part of your monthly assessment or monthly maintenance contribution is going to reserves, and rightfully so. But the better that you communicate these things, and the better that the community understands them, and when you're doing your budgets and so forth, usually a large contribution, a large expense is the contribution to reserves. You're communicating this to the community. They understand what it's for. It makes it a lot easier, and for them to understand it. And that's especially true in younger communities where they don't actually see these projects going on. You're in a young community that's maybe 8 or 9 years old. You're saving money, and you're putting this money away, but you're not having to actually perform any of these reserve projects because they've got a longer life expectancy. So it's important to communicate and for people to understand why this big chunk of money in the budget every year is going to this item called reserves. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Fannie Mae and reserves. I think Russ alluded to it earlier with, some states and smaller governments have, local governments, have statutory requirements with regard to the reserves. Fannie Mae has a requirement that at least 10% of the annual assessments, are going to the reserve each year. And I say that to everybody, that 10% is probably way too small, or could be too small, depending upon what assets you have in your community that need to be replaced ultimately. But it's worth saying, and it's worth noting, because lenders do recognize that reserves are a big part of a community's overall financial health. And I think increasingly, especially since 2008, after the meltdown and especially the crash of the real estate markets, these project questionnaires and the financial institutions are looking a lot more closely at an association's financial health. And reserves are certainly an important part of that. So we really need, I can't stress to everybody who's listening, that boards sometimes have a hard time, with this reserve idea, and really, do we have to put all this money away? And we really want to keep our maintenance fees as low as we can. And I would just caution all of you and remind all of you, Russ said used the F word, fiduciary word, but it's really a vitally important part to make sure that you've got a reserve study that's up to date, and that you are actually reserving in accordance with your study. And I guess I'll just wrap this part up by saying that, board members, many of you are lay people. You're not experts, and so you engage experts, to do a reserve study. Then you have the results of it, and then you don't follow those recommendations. You put yourself kind of in jeopardy when you don't do that, because you recognize that you need an expert to give you some advice with what you ought to be doing. Then you have that done, but you don't actually follow through. It's important that you follow through. I can't stress that enough. And with that, I'll say that my portion of the presentation is over, and I'll turn it over to Bill. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, we've been through a whole lot of information here, and we're not going to take a break, but we can all relax a little bit, because the remaining slides are more discussion slides. The CAI Reserve Specialist designation, we heard a lot about this, and Russ has one of the earliest numbers. I think it's like number 17, and now there are thousands of them across the globe. This is an international designation. So what is actually required in one of these reports if it follows the guidelines? I see so many reports prepared by all types of different professionals that are providing what they're calling reserve study, and it has a bunch of stuff in it that does not belong there, and it is missing stuff that does belong there. This slide shows the very basics. The following two slides show the very basics of what is actually required according to the guidelines. A description of the property, that's pretty obvious. Type of buildings, number of units. A description of the level of service. Is it a level 1 study, a level 2 study, or a level 3 study? A level 1 study is a full study right from the beginning, using no one else's information. A level 2 is an update, where you have a legitimate existing study which is updated based on changes on the property, changes in conditions of the elements, and also the bank account. And a level 3 study is simply putting in a new bank balance and running the old information. Someone fired a question through in the chat line about this level 2 update and said, should someone inspect the site? Obviously, if you're going to get good information about relating to an update, you have to visit the site as the professional, see whether the concrete is doing as well as it was projected, see whether the roofing is performing, and it's actually required and included in that scope of service. So I hope that answers that question. Another requirement is to identify the starting year of the study and the current account balance. Scott went on about how important it is to give an accurate report on what is the available funding. Then you get into the technical stuff, tabular listings of the common elements, quantities and descriptions, ages, projected remaining life, and useful life. Russ went through these in the spreadsheet charts. And a current replacement cost estimate for the items. This is where, in these past two line items here, the experience of the preparer comes into play, and ideally, professional architects that are involved in this type of work, professional engineers that are involved in this type of work would have the best information to estimate both the useful life, the remaining life, and the replacement cost. Next slide, please. So this is a continuation of the requirements. The preparer must offer projected funding scenarios ranging out for a minimum of 20 years. As Russ stated, the typical standard right now in this region is 30 years. Incorporation of interest and inflation is required by the guidelines offered by the CAI. And finally, you get the recommendation for the required funding, ranging out for 20 years again. And anything else that any provider offers is outside of the prescribed scope of work and not required in a reserve study, and actually does not belong there. Now, what I've offered here are the guidelines of the actual requirements. Next slide. What a reserve study is not. There are so many people who enter into purchasing the scope of work that do not understand what it is, what it actually includes, and what its limitations are. One of the biggest limitations in a reserve study, which has already been covered, is the fact that the majority of the information that is included in this study are estimates. They are professional opinions. A reserve study is not a deficiency report. It is not intended to inspect the property to find what is wrong with the property, where defects are, where code violations are. That's a completely different scope of work. It is not a maintenance plan. Maintenance should not be included or considered in any way in a reserve study. A reserve study is for replacements only. And it is also not a specification for corrective work. Unfortunately, we engage many clients who come to us in the middle of the process and they say, well, we thought you were going to do this, we thought you were going to do that. And the scope of work should be clearly defined in any professional's proposal to the client, but the clients do not always read the proposals in great detail. One of the things that I do for many of my clients when they're asking for a proposal is I actually forward them a link to the CAI's RS designation application form, which actually describes everything that an RS needs to do. It's a very eye-opening document for many people. Next slide. What should not be included in a reserve study? We've already touched on some of this stuff, and I've already alluded to some of it. Maintenance is not a reserve item. Maintenance can be used to extend the life of a component. Landscaping, obviously, is also not a reserve item. And repairs, same as maintenance, are not reserve items. They are maintenance activities that can be used to extend the life of a common element, but they're not a common element cost. A useful question in understanding this, the first, excuse me, first bullet below is pretty straightforward and serious. Does the entire item get removed, and is it replaced with new? If you've got iron railings that are rusting and you hire a welder and he comes in and he puts in a new piece and it gets painted, you're extending the life of that item. You're not replacing it. All right. And a little bit more, just being a little glib, does the item get carried away in a dumpster? That's really the criteria for a common element replacement. And in the early days, I actually heard people calling reserve studies replacement reserve studies. You need to think about that when you are deriving the list of what should or should not be included. Next slide. Aesthetics. This came into conversation when the federal lending guidelines came into play. And I had a client that was a 40-year-old HOA with miles and miles and miles of roadways and miles of concrete sidewalks. And they were woefully underfunded, but they were maintaining their property to make it serviceable. Serviceable is a key word here. Now, gauging the remaining useful life can bring in aesthetics into play. And concrete and asphalt and siding are three huge components that come at great cost when they get replaced. Now, if you have sidewalks on your property and they don't look great, but you can walk on them, and if you have localized areas requiring repair and you have a maintenance budget and an actual plan to maintain that element, it can be given an extended life in a reserve study. The same thing with asphalt. As Russ said, if I've got asphalt with cracks everywhere, I can still drive on it. But if I get a pothole that's going to swallow a tire and damage a car, I have to repair it. But I can still drive on that asphalt. Vinyl and aluminum siding, I've seen siding on buildings that's 40 years old and it does not look good, but it is serviceable. So when we get a client that has these hurdles that they need to get over in order to maintain their federal lending designations, we will work with them on subjects like this, determining the serviceability and the aesthetics of an item, and we can extend the life. But we will only do that with footnoting in the report, stating that the life of this item has been extended because the community is committed to a maintenance program. So this is one way particularly for older properties and ones that may be underfunded, that they can manage this problem. Next slide. This is a great one to end on. As Scott alluded to, this is a team effort. It's a completely inappropriate expectation for a board to commission a reserve study and sit back, do nothing, and wait for it to come in and expect it to be the best product. I offer the analogy of building a house. I used to build houses. It's a team effort. You've got a builder contractor, you've got an architect, and you have the owner. That triangle of people have to work together in order to get to the best result. The same is true in preparing a reserve study. You have a reserve specialist, you have a property manager, and you have the community board. They all need to communicate and contribute and agree in arriving at the best possible product. Next slide. We're into questions now. So if you want to use the chat box, you can do that. I've seen two questions come in and I've already answered one. The other question was, which states require that a professional prepare a reserve study and provide it for a community? Maryland does not have this yet, although it comes up in Annapolis every year and it's been shot down. I actually went out twice and testified in behalf of making it a requirement. I do not believe it's required in Delaware either. Russ may know something about that, but I will tell you an interesting story about Virginia. Virginia passed the law about 5 years ago, maybe even longer than that. And immediately after the law was passed, we actually still had fax machines at that time. We couldn't keep paper in our fax machine. We couldn't answer the phone. We couldn't answer emails quickly enough because thousands of properties were scrambling to get their first reserve study. So if we get the law passed in Maryland, I anticipate that we may be in the same position again. So with that, I don't have any more questions to respond to. So Stephen, maybe you want to pick up now?
Hi, Bill. Actually, we've had a few come in. So how about, I think they're coming directly to the organizer, which is me. So how about if I read them off and then I can
fine.
leave them up for you guys to
Yeah, and
answer.
I can delegate off to Scott or Russ if appropriate.
Perfect. Okay, so one question that came in is that developers tend to use builder-grade material. As an association, we might want to consider upgrading materials. How do we get that concept into a study?
Oh, that's a great question, and we do get this quite a bit. And again, this is where the team comes into play. If the community wants to upgrade an item, roofing is typically a great example. If the builder provided a standard 3-tab shingle with a realistic functional life between 15 and 18 years, and you want to go with a super high quality shingle, if you tell us, we can make that show up accurately in reserve study. But you have to tell us. Great.
Next question. Some communities had to use reserves for emergencies. So how, does the panel have some tips for getting back on track if behind the financial eight ball?
Okay, I call this stealing or pirating, but I'm a little harsh on that, I think. But maybe Scott should take a shot at trying this answer.
Yeah. So and they're as you know, the reserve funds are earmarked specifically for the replacement of reserves. But let's face it, sometimes that happens, and I think in conjunction with your outside auditor, who will probably tell you that you need to formulate a plan to repay the reserves as quickly as possible if you've had to. I've seen it happen for, we used the example earlier of a huge snow season where, you pay $250,000 for snow removal and you had a budget of, say, $50,000. You need to repay yourselves because you are taking away from funds that have been earmarked for replacement. So you need to do that as quickly as you can. And I would recommend that you do it through the budgeting process and increase your contributions to your reserves in subsequent years, to repay yourselves for whatever it is that you borrowed. But you should also talk to your auditor when you do that, because they're going to give you some advice as it relates to taxes and so forth. And all I can tell you is to repay yourself as quickly as possible, and don't make a habit out of that. Some associations also, put a contingency line item in their budgets to offset unanticipated expenses, and that's probably not a bad idea either, because robbing from the reserves and then not paying them back, is a recipe ultimately for a problem down the road.
Great, thanks, Scott. Bill, you mentioned the 3 different levels of a reserve study. Could you give an approximate cost for each of those?
Oh, I'm going to answer that this way. The cost of a reserve study fluctuates greatly based on the property. If I have an HOA that, we have HOAs that own nothing more than an entrance monument with 2 lights in the ground to light it up. And we have properties that are 30-story high rises that have tens and tens of millions of dollars worth of common element. So the costs obviously vary greatly. So, what I would say is this, that a typical 4-story condominium building, couple of buildings and a small site, maybe they have a small clubhouse, we might do a reserve study. Let's just make up a number. It might be $3,500. all right? If we did an update 3 years later of that same study, we can do it for almost half that. So there's a very big difference in the cost of a full study and a level 2 update. And the level 3 update is something that this is where we don't really do anything except change the bank balance and run the program again. This is done typically if a community just wants to do it every year, all right? We do have properties that do that. And it can also be done if something radical changed regarding one element or whatever. If a tornado comes through, rips the roof off of eight buildings, you have to replace them immediately. Now you've got 8 buildings that have a roof with a different age. That would be the type of thing where we might just run a new study without visiting the site. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few questions left. So if the board doesn't have the same level of experience as the experts who are doing the reserve study, how can they ensure that the numbers are accurate?
That is a great question. Go ahead, Scott.
So, as I alluded to in what I said, when you have a study done, I completely recommend, even if the board does have a great understanding of it, have the preparer come to a meeting, with the community manager and sit down and review that document and go over it with them until they understand it. You've invested in the study, which is, the right thing to do, but just to have the document without really understanding it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. And I think that it's certainly, I know that all the reserve specialists that I've done, business with over the years are always more than happy to sit down with their clients and make sure that they understand the study and then can use it effectively. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. We issue a draft, all right, and that's the purpose of the draft. It's to have everybody look at it and say, well, wait a minute, I don't understand this. And sometimes very important things get clarified, such as, oh, this is a great one, Scott. I just realized we should talk about the fact that documents are conflicted often. The condominium documents, your governing documents, often have conflicts in them in regard to defining common elements. And my favorite story on this is we've had a client in Pikesville, Maryland for 25 years. We still work with this same client. We've done their reserve study numerous times. Through the course of board changes, boards have made the decision to remove certain common elements because their documents are unclear. We have taken hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of balcony decks in and out of their reserve study, maybe 5 times. So that's another interesting aspect of this work. When the documents are radically unclear on a major item, we immediately recommend that the client go to a lawyer and get a written opinion on interpreting the documents. So I hope that also helps to add to the answer to that question.
Yeah,
great.
That's absolutely great advice, Phil.
Okay, so actually we've had quite a few more questions come in. So are there best practices of convincing a property manager and board for using the study? And this kind of goes back to, especially if the reserve study was used for emergency repairs.
I'll give that one back to Scott.
Sorry, would you read the question again? I wasn't really sure I understood that question.
So how to convince a property manager and board to use a reserve study, especially for budgeting when the community is financially behind due to emergency repairs.
Okay, so I go back to the F word, the fiduciary responsibility, and sometimes boards don't really understand that concept, and that's an important concept to understand because that doesn't mean keeping your maintenance fees artificially low. What it means is that the board, when adopting a budget, provides for all of the needs of the association and providing for all the services, including the replacement of the assets that it's responsible for replacing for. So, you know, if you're having if you're conflicted about, oh my gosh, we don't want to raise the maintenance fees, but, we're not meeting our reserve obligation. The truth of the matter is you have to adopt a budget that allows you to take care of your expenses, and that reserve contribution is one of them. And sometimes that's a painful process, but you have to do that. And hopefully managers and boards will, where I see this really getting to be a problem in a lot of areas is when the maintenance fees have been kept artificially low over a period of time, and then there's a big wake-up moment. So what I would say is, even if you can't make the contribution all in one year, you need to be working on that in subsequent budgets when you're doing it. So if you have to get there in 3 or 4 years, you have to get there in 3 or 4 years, but you have to get there. And it's irresponsible of both the board and the advice from their managing agent if their managing agent isn't making the recommendation to them that, hey, we need to get there, we need to do this. And I imagine that in the context of this new coronavirus and all of the financial fallout, we may see coming forward some really difficult decisions being made in the future. But you really just stick to your guns and work on it, because not doing it's unacceptable.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Bill, going back to the level 1, 2, and 3, if a community or a condo had a level 2 study done in 2019, what level would be the next study that would be needed?
Okay, that's a good question. Again, it would depend on the quality of the report as it exists. If they're 2019, all right, they're doing this in a timely manner. They could opt to do a level 3, which is just the financial update. But if they have any concerns about anything that's happening on the property in regard to the performance of given common elements, they should go with the level 2. Also, related to this question, we get lots of people handing us existing studies to update. And when we look at the study, it's just not worthy of updating. So in that case, we tell them that we would only do the work for them if they bump up to a level 1 full study.
Great, thank you. So also then kind of going back to what goes in and what stays out, is it reasonable or recommended to include a deficiency or safety report with the reserve study?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. The deficiency report is a scope of work that is conducted on a new property. That is one that is typically less than 3 years old, because there is opportunity to go back to the developer to get corrective work done. Now, when that scope of work is done, it's most often called a transition study. And a transition study includes the deficiency report and the capital reserve together as a package. So you would only do a deficiency report if you are looking to address items with your developer. If your opportunity to pursue the developer is gone, then the sole purpose of a deficiency report would be for you to understand your problems. Still value there, and we have had properties that are 10 years old ask us to do a transition study, even though they have no opportunity to pursue the builder. That was a good question.
Great. I think, Bill, you've covered kind of what goes into the 1, 2, and 3. And maybe we could even just give some examples in the slides before we send those out. So there's a question then about, is it possible to request the reserve study firm to change the expected life of a particular line item? So for example, asphalt. If it's estimated at 20, but the community has experienced that it lasts significantly longer than that, Like, what can they request a change of? How would they go about doing that? If somebody could maybe just kind of speak to that.
Yeah, I can take that. And I think I got into that a little bit before the end of the program. That's something that they would bring up when they're reviewing the draft, and they would explain, their position to us, and we would, state, well, this was our opinion, and we would explain why, and then there would be a dialogue. And if they wanted us to extend the life of that element, we would again probably go ahead and do that with a footnote in the report that, it was that the client intends to, throw whatever maintenance and repair, quotient at that element to keep it serviceable. Serviceable, again, is the catchphrase keyword.
Great, thanks, Bill. We had several questions about pipes and risers and the fact that they can't be visually inspected. So how are they able to kind of estimate those, and especially since it's such an expensive part of the building?
Okay, I'm going to take a shot at that, and then I'm going to pass to Russ. One of the things to consider is that we're not going to include an item that has a lifespan typically of 30 years outside the range of the study unless there's a known reason to be suspect of its ability to perform. So piping is typically not included in reserve studies unless you're talking about an older high-rise building, because then that you at a point in time are going to do at least riser replacements for water. And if you have hydronic HVAC systems, you're going to be doing that type of work. So Russ, do you want to jump in and add anything to that?
Yeah, that's an issue that sometimes comes up. It usually starts with a leak,
Right.
of course, and that leak tends to be identified and repaired, by itself. But that's often the first trigger of people starting to think about the risers, and the fact that we should start planning for dealing with them. But it's, Bill, you're right. We don't normally include riser replacement until there's a history that, hey, we're starting to see some leaks. We've repaired a couple, but they're not going to get better. We need to start planning for it. And then there's different types of there's different ways of dealing with risers. In some instances, they can be lined instead of replaced. In other instances, you just have to replace it. So there's a lot of different caveats there. So in short, it's not usually an item unless we know there's a problem that needs to be addressed at some point. And the other,
Right.
The corollary to that is also the expansion connections, expansion couplers and risers. Sometimes they start to have a history of needing replacement. The pipes may be fine, but the expansion couplers themselves start to fail. So again, if you start having that history, then we can start planning for it.
Right, and I'd like to expound on that again. And it's a very difficult situation, and there is a catch-22 here also, is you can begin to predict the fact that there will be an eventual replacement just on age alone. If we go into a 40-year-old building, we know that the pipes are not going to last another 30 years. So we should be making that, I'm going to put air quotes, guess. We should be guessing at that point in time that they start funding for that. And one way of doing that is creating what we call an allowance. We can not throw the full $200,000 at it at a given moment in time, but we can say it would be prudent for you to put $10,000 away every 2 or 3 years, give it a cycle in the report, and let that allowance be building up to avert the catastrophe of a sudden $200,000 need. The other thing I wanted to say is we have numerous clients, we give them a reserve study and they say, well, why don't you put this in? Why don't you put that in? Piping, why don't you put underground buried sewer? Why don't you put all this stuff in there? And then we put the numbers in and they have what I call a holy crap moment, they're going, wow, now we have to reserve for $50 billion. It's because you asked for it. So you have to be careful what you ask for.
So I think just to follow up on that, Bill, thank you both for that answer. We had another question about sprinkler systems, and that this would be more of a maintenance. And Bill, I believe you kind of spoke to this in your section of that it might not be replaced, but the sprinkler system might have to be emptied and refilled because the water becomes putrid. So would that be part of a reserve study, or is that considered maintenance?
That's absolutely system maintenance and repair, but we often include sprinkler head replacements, just the heads themselves. Again, this is typically in larger buildings, not typically in HOAs or smaller wood frame condos. But if you have a 30-year-old building and it's fully sprinklered, you should absolutely be considering sprinkler head replacement as a reserve study item. And Bill's rule, yes, they do get removed. They do go away in a dumpster. So it can be considered a capital item.
Great, thank you. Scott, I believe you spoke to soft cost items in the reserve study, and we had a couple of people ask if you could just give a couple examples of what those would be.
Okay, so for example, I think I used this illustration or this example earlier. Say you're having an expensive asphalt replacement project throughout the community. It's a big community, so it's very likely that you're going to have to hire someone to oversee that project. And what I mean by oversee is I don't mean your community manager, because you need to have someone with some expertise out there, making sure that all of the slope and all of the drainage and so forth is correct. So that would be an example of a soft cost that you wouldn't see necessarily in the reserve study, but in order to accomplish the replacement of all that asphalt roadway, you're going to have to include that in what you're doing when you replace it.
Yeah, soft costs can include design and engineering. If you're going to rebuild a retaining wall, that type of stuff, they can be put in there. And that brings me to an interesting anecdote that I had thought about including in this. Now, I don't know how many people on the line have seen the Johnny Depp pirate movies, Pirates of the Caribbean. They talk about the pirate code, and that it's not really a code, it's just guidelines. Well, it's the same with reserve studies. What gets included and what does not get included are based on guidelines. And different clients will ask us specifically to put things in that, as I've spent a great deal of time today discussing, probably don't belong there, but they can get added in. It's just runs the numbers up. It's just more math. And we have had communities ask us to include $10,000 to pay for the deficiency report, which is not something that you throw in a dumpster. But if they want it in, we put it in and we footnote it that it was a request of the client. That's how we cover ourselves as professionals. But these are guidelines.
Okay, and the last question I have is, again, going for the bill test of what stays in and what is left out. And that is gas lines and common gas meters when those need to be replaced. Would that be something that would be recommended to include?
Gas lines are same answer as with the water piping. I haven't been on a project yet where the gas lines were replaced, but again, if I was in a 60 or 80-year-old historical building that was converted into a condo, and the builder was such a criminal that they did not replace the aging piping. I had one of these in Virginia and one of them in Baltimore. I'm not making this up. Then that would be a concern, but that would be a very rare condition. Now, the meters, I'm going to ask Russ to take this. Aren't the meters owned by the utility?
I was going to say that. I don't think I've been on a site where the gas lines were owned by an association. Usually that's owned by the utility, right up to and including the meter. So that's something definitely I want to look into before we just recommend reserving for them. The gas lines, not unlike the other pipes we talked about, more often than not, if there is an issue, it is identified and repaired. I've never seen a full-scale replacement of gas lines.
Right. It would have to be a very old building.
Right.
Great. Okay. Well, with that, I'd like to, first of all, really thank our speakers for not only all of the great information today and putting the presentation together, but being adaptive with us and over the last week to 10 days, kind of taking the in-person presentation and making it work for today's webinar. So thank you to Russ and Scott and Bill for being able to make this possible. The contact information will be in the slides that will be posted. And then lastly, I'd like to thank all of the attendees. As I've mentioned, you will be getting an email that will have a survey, which we really encourage you to fill out to give us some feedback on the webinar today. And then also it will have a link to where the video is on our member section of the webpage, as well as the slides that you'll be able to download. So also thank you to the attendees. We had over 50 people on the call today. We really appreciate everybody remaining muted, and I think we had very little background noise, which made it, I think, much more enjoyable for everybody. So we hope to see everybody in person again very soon. Thank you for attending today, and we hope everybody stays safe and stays healthy. Thank you.
Thanks.